Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here today to talk to you about some of the work that we've done looking at long-term outcomes after autoimmune encephalitis. Just to begin with some disclosures, I'm currently a full-time employee of Bristol Myers Squibb, but I was not at the time that this work was done. I am also on the board of directors and on the medical advisory board for the Autoimmune Encephalitis Alliance. In today's talk, I'd really like to convey some of the domains that may be affected long-term after autoimmune encephalitis and help everyone to recognize the significant healthcare costs and the personal and family impact that is imposed by autoimmune encephalitis. One of the questions that I get asked frequently is how common is this disease? There are only a handful of incidence studies looking at autoimmune encephalitis across the world. This is one study that we're working on currently, looking at the incidence of NMDA receptor encephalitis specifically across New York City. To do this, we used a rare epilepsy database that has cataloged neurology nodes and EEG reports across 5 centers in Manhattan and the Bronx. We identified 15 cases over the 5-year study period. Accounting for potentially missed cases, such as those who may not have had seizures during their clinical presentation and those who may not have received care at one of our study site hospitals, we estimated an incidence of 0.18 per 100,000. So I get asked frequently, if this is so rare, why is this an important area of study and why should people care about long-term outcomes after this disease? Well, there's a few reasons. First of all, seizure burden is high. And we know that suboptimally controlled seizures in individuals with epilepsy, for example, can result in negative effects on cognition, mood, and long-term functional abilities. And the same is likely true for individuals with autoimmune encephalitis. In this study, we sought to quantify the burden of seizures in the autoimmune encephalitis group. And to do this, we did a systematic review looking at the literature on seizures in this disease. And what we found was that really across all types of autoimmune encephalitis, up to about 75% had seizures at some point during their hospital course or their initial clinical presentation. And close to 90% had abnormalities on EEG. These numbers were really relatively similar across the different encephalitis types, of course, with variation depending on the particular associated autoantibody. We tried to identify reasons why some individuals may have seizures and others may not. And one thing that seemed to hold true was that age seemed to be associated with seizure prevalence. So what we found was that the younger individuals, particularly those in the adolescent age, were more likely to have seizures, both across all comers of autoimmune encephalitis and within the NMDA receptor encephalitis subgroup in particular. Another reason why this is an important area of study is the cost burden associated with care for autoimmune encephalitis patients. In this study, we looked at length of stay and hospital charges across patients with autoimmune encephalitis and found that the median length of stay was about 15 days and the median hospital charge per patient was close to $75,000. Interestingly here, so not surprisingly, as the length of stay and the ICU length of stay increased, so did the charges associated with care for that individual. We then sought to compare these findings of patients with autoimmune encephalitis to those who were admitted for herpes simplex encephalitis. And what we found here was that our individuals with autoimmune encephalitis had longer lengths of stay for within both the ICU and non-ICU admitted patients, and also had a significantly higher hospital charge per patient. So where the median, as I said, was nearly $75,000 in the autoimmune encephalitis group, it was closer to $20,000 in the herpes simplex encephalitis group. What we saw here is that looking over time through the study, in the blue line, you can see here that the charges for herpes simplex encephalitis patients really remained stable over time, where the total charges per patient seem to increase over our study period for individuals with autoimmune encephalitis. And this is likely a reflection of the increased testing that we've been able to do for these participants, as well as the medications that are used, which can be quite costly. Recently, there's also been emphasis on trying to understand what some of the social determinants of health are in individuals with encephalitis. And so in this study, we looked at both all comers with autoimmune encephalitis as well as the anti-NMDA receptor subgroup across our patients at Mount Sinai in New York City, as well as at Columbia and Cornell, also in New York City. And we found a few trends here that I think are worth noting. We found that when we looked at Black individuals, their Glasgow Coma Scale scores on admission were significantly lower than those who were not white or those who were white. We think this may reflect delays to accessing care for these individuals. We also saw that length of hospital stay was longer for individuals who were Black and for individuals who were not white as compared to those who were white. When looking at interval from the hospital admission to diagnosis, we found that those with public insurance and those who were uninsured experienced longer intervals. And similarly, when we looked at hospital length of stay, those who were uninsured experienced longer lengths of stay as compared to those with private and public insurance. And this likely reflects the issue of disposition or trying to figure out how to safely discharge patients home or out of the hospital when they do not have insurance. As we've seen in many of the talks today, and as many of you are probably aware, most of the research within autoimmune encephalitis really has been focused on identifying autoantibody mechanisms, improving diagnostic techniques, and evaluating different immunotherapy strategies. And I think really we're moving into the forefront now of improved understanding of comprehensive and long-term outcomes after these diseases. One of the most pivotal papers in this space is this paper from Martin Titulaer's group published in 2013 that looked at disability outcomes in NMDA receptor encephalitis specifically. They used the modified Rankin scale scores here and noted a score of 0 to 2 as a quote unquote good outcome and a score of 3 to 6 as a poor outcome. And what you can see in this figure here is that the number of individuals who had this good outcome increased until about 18 months, at which point it seems to plateau. And I think this is where the convention has come that we tell patients and families to expect a long recovery process, but that recovery potentially can be good with up to 80% having good outcomes at a year and a half. I think there's a few limitations to this study though. One is that a good outcome includes a score of a 2 here, which is unable to carry out all previous activities. And I think that while this is certainly a huge improvement from where patients come to us in the hospital, to have a young adult who's no longer able to do the things that they used to do certainly can be challenging and pose problems for patients and their families. Second of all, this score does not consider the cognitive, behavioral, or other symptoms that patients present with. So it doesn't really capture what is happening to those domains. And then I think finally, this study has been perhaps inaccurately extrapolated to other forms of autoimmune encephalitis where we don't necessarily know that such good outcomes may be seen in those individuals. So we've done a couple of studies to try to combat these issues. In this study, we just asked individuals with autoimmune encephalitis to tell us about some of the persistent deficits that they were experiencing. And what we found was that more than 4 years after their initial diagnosis, about 50% of individuals were still experiencing difficulty with emotional ability and short-term memory, and about a third still experiencing difficulty with fatigue and concentration. Quite shockingly, when we looked at the percentage of patients who were working or at school, we found that prior to encephalitis, where 80% had either been employed or in school, this number dropped down to 44%, so dropped almost by half after their encephalitis. And again, this was more than 4 years after their encephalitis. As part of the study, we also looked at adaptive function, which is sort of the idea of being able to accomplish age expected tasks and keep up with community expectations of oneself. So some of the questions that this tool includes are things like relies on him or herself for travel in the community, such as being able to use public transportation on their own or being able to drive a car. And what we found here was that our individuals with autoimmune encephalitis on average scored significantly below the normative population, both on the total score or this GAC score, as well as on each of the subdomains. The cutoff for an average score is 90, so the average score for our subjects actually fell in the below average range. So then we wanted to look at how did the modified Rankin scale score associate with this adaptive function score. And not surprisingly, as one's MRS score becomes worse, so does their adaptive function score. But what's noteworthy here is that when you look at individuals who scored in the good range for modified Rankin scale scores, a large proportion still scored below average on adaptive function, which means that really just looking at motor disability through the modified Rankin scale score doesn't tell us the full picture and does miss some of the deficits and difficulties that patients will be experiencing. We wanted to see within our individuals with autoimmune encephalitis, what were some of the factors that were associated with better or worse scores. So we looked at a number of factors. We looked at sex, age, antibody type, time to diagnosis, time to treatment, the type of treatment received. And the only variable that really seemed to associate with outcomes was whether or not an individual had NMDA receptor encephalitis. So we see here that those in that subgroup actually scored significantly better than those with other forms of autoimmune encephalitis. And these individuals were actually in the normal range. Additionally, fewer subjects with NMDA receptor encephalitis actually described difficulties with emotional lability, short-term memory, and fatigue. So then we wanted to look within the NMDA receptor encephalitis group in particular to see what mediated outcome. And what we found here was that there seemed to be some association between the age at symptom onset and long-term outcomes, even when we corrected for the time to study enrollment. So what you can see here is that the individuals who were younger at the time of their symptom onset had worse scores on adaptive function long-term compared to those who were in their early adulthood at the time of diagnosis and symptom onset. This particular analysis was not statistically significant, I think because of some of the older individuals in the study. However, when we restrict the age group just from 0 to 18 in the pediatric group, this analysis does become statistically significant. Put slightly differently, when we look at the individuals with a presumed prepubertal onset to their illness, long-term outcomes seemed significantly worse than when we looked at those who were in the postpubertal to young adult phase at the time of symptom onset. In another study, we wanted to look at the long-term impact on psychosocial well-being of autoimmune encephalitis. And in these analyses that I'm going to show you today, I'm just looking at the NMDA receptor encephalitis subgroup. So what we found here was that our individuals with NMDA receptor encephalitis demonstrated worse overall psychosocial function after illness. And you can see that here with the higher mean score. And this was compared to a general population enriched for chronic illness. So not healthy individuals, but people who were already battling with some form of chronic illness. And then what we looked at here was different factors that mediated worse outcome. And what we found was that when the individual had ongoing difficulty with sleep, seizures, or some sort of neuropsychiatric symptom, their psychosocial outcomes were worse. Some of the domains that seemed to be most affected from pre to post illness included worrying about health interfering with my life, feeling isolated from others, and worrying about the future. We again wanted to look at employment and schooling status as we did previously, but delved into this a little bit further. And what we found that was that of those individuals who did return to work or school, more than a quarter were receiving accommodations. And of those who did not return to work or school, nearly half were receiving government assistance. Some of the factors associated with whether an individual returned to employment or school was whether or not they had a misdiagnosis, which was associated with not returning to employment or school, as well as not having psychiatry follow-up. And what's interesting here is that while 95% of individuals in this study saw a neurologist, only about a third had follow-up with a psychiatrist. And of course, there are likely many confounders for this association, but I do think that it calls into question an emphasis for us on the importance of multidisciplinary follow-up for individuals to make sure that we're really addressing all of the domains that are being affected for them after their acute illness. We also wanted to look at how we're doing preparing patients and their families for the transition from inpatient to outpatient care. And in this study, the majority of individuals disagreed with the following statements. They did not feel that they had a readable and easily understood written plan for how their healthcare needs were going to be met in the outpatient world. They did not feel confident that they knew how to manage their health, and they did not have a good understanding for their health condition and what makes it better or worse. We also looked at caregiver burden in this study. And what we found was that on average, our individuals who cared for somebody with NMDA receptor encephalitis specifically scored in the moderate to severe burden range on a caregiver burden survey. And associated factors, again, were for higher caregiver burden were when the individual that they were caring for had persistent seizures, fatigue, and neuropsychiatric symptoms. Some of the items of greatest burden here were that individuals were afraid for what the future held for their relative. They felt stressed between caring for their relative and trying to meet other responsibilities for their family or work, and that they felt that the time that they spent with their relative meant that they did not have sufficient time for themselves. And while some of these studies, I think, sort of seem obvious perhaps, or seem as things that we might expect to be affected for any individual who has a significant illness, I think really identifying the particular domains and the particular individuals who are likely to be struck with some of these poor psychosocial well-being, as well as caregiver burden, can be really helpful in developing interventional tools. So we're working now with the Autoimmune Encephalitis Alliance to really develop some materials for physicians as well as for patients and their families that may help to address some of these issues. Fatigue is another area of interest for us to look at. It's something that we hear from patients all the time following their illness, and it makes sense as it's something that's seen in other neuroinflammatory conditions chronically, such as multiple sclerosis. So in this study, we looked at the Modified Fatigue Impact Scale, the Beck's Depression Inventory Fast Screen, and the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, and administered these to a group of individuals with both autoimmune encephalitis and infectious encephalitis. And not surprisingly, we found that fatigue was moderately correlated with depression, as well as sleep quality, and that depression was also moderately correlated with sleep quality. However, the relationship between fatigue and encephalitis persisted even when controlling for sleep quality and depression, suggesting that there really is some sort of true biological after effect for these patients. We again looked at a whole host of variables that may associate with who has more problems with fatigue, and specifically fatigue over sleep and depression. And again found that the only variable that associated here was the encephalitis type, such that individuals who had NMDA receptor encephalitis seemed to have lower levels of overall fatigue, as well as physical and cognitive fatigue as compared to others. And these rates did not differ in the depression and sleep quality measures that we used. Another strong area of interest for us is in improving the understanding of the cognitive effects of encephalitis. So in this study of all comers with encephalitis, we administered the European Brain Injury Questionnaire to get a sense of what domains we should be looking at as being affected long-term for individuals. And what we found here was that the somatic domain was the most affected, followed by the cognitive and the communication domains. And interestingly, when we compared our results with other studies published in the literature, we found that our encephalitis patients actually performed worse on this measure compared to stroke individuals in all domains except the physical domain, which makes sense because that would be where you would expect stroke individuals to have more effects. But this sort of suggests that some of the issues that individuals are facing, particularly with these three domains that I mentioned, are quite significant and debilitating, even more so than the stroke population, for example. So then we wanted to look a little bit more closely at doing objective measures of cognition and neuroimaging as well, structural imaging. And in this pilot study, we had 16 individuals who underwent a full cognitive battery as well as structural imaging. And what we found was that 10 out of 16 individuals scored below 1 standard deviation from the mean on at least one domain. And the most commonly affected domains here were social cognition, executive functioning, and complex cognition. I only have preliminary structural imaging data to show you, but I hope that I can sort of make the case here of the individuals whose imaging has been analyzed, that their thalamic volumes, putamen volumes, and amygdala volumes appear to be potentially lower long-term after their acute illness as compared to the healthy controls in the study. And this does not go unequivocally for all brain regions. And just to show you that, for example, there does not appear to be a difference in caudate volume between these two groups. There are certainly other groups who have looked at cognition and structural imaging following NMDA receptor encephalitis specifically as well. This is from Martin Titulare's group as well, where they looked at neuropsychiatric testing, or I'm sorry, neuropsychological testing following NMDA receptor encephalitis. And what they found was that individuals seem to have difficulty long-term with sustained attention, long-term verbal memory, fatigue in particular. And then when they looked at when they looked at the relationship between many of these domains, they found that quality of life seemed to be associated with fatigue in particular, such as when fatigue is worse, this really impacts one's quality of life. There have been a number of studies looking at structural imaging as well, particularly coming out of the Fink group. In this study, they demonstrated that long-term after NMDA receptor encephalitis, that hippocampal volumes were significantly reduced bilaterally, and that the left-sided volumes in particular, and as well as mean diffusivity on that side, was correlated with verbal memory performance, disease severity, and duration. In this study, they looked at functional connectivity and found that despite normal structural imaging in the majority of these patients during the acute period, there was widespread alterations of functional connectivity in the chronic period and the long-term period, most notably in the hippocampus, medial temporal, and frontotemporal regions, and that memory impairment correlated with these changes. And then finally, they looked at superficial white matter damage and found that there were effects long-term in these individuals, predominantly in the frontal and temporal lobes. And again, these changes also correlated with working memory, verbal memory, visual spatial memory, and attention. In the last few minutes, I want to share some pilot work that we are doing looking at changes in language throughout the course of illness, particularly in NMDA receptor encephalitis. And to do this, we use natural language processing, which is a form of machine learning in which subtle patterns and changes within language are analyzed. And we were fortunate to work with some colleagues at IBM to do the analysis for this data. So this technique has been used to predict or correlate with clinical features in many disorders, including schizophrenia, psychosis, and Alzheimer's disease. And working with some of our psychiatry colleagues at Mount Sinai, they've used this tool in a group of kids and adolescents who are at clinically high risk for the development of psychosis, and found that these models have been able to predict the onset of psychosis with an accuracy of 83%. So what we did for this study was collected writing samples from individuals with NMDA receptor encephalitis at various time points prior to and following their hospitalization. We then took these writing samples, anonymized them, and used the natural language processing to divide these writing samples into 36 parts of speech tags. And then also looked at how the words associate with each other, which is a concept called semantic coherence. We then ran several models to look at, to compare the different writing sample time points. So for example, we compared 1 year before to 3 months before, and then we compared 1 year before and 3 months before to 1 month before hospitalization. And we repeated this process 25 times, looking for different time point gatherings that led to the greatest differentiation. And through these models, we were able to categorize time points into 3 sets. A pre-illness set, which was defined as the 12 months prior to hospitalization. An acute illness phase, which is 3 months before hospitalization to 12 months after hospitalization, and a recovery phase, which was 24 months following hospitalization. After understanding which stages of illness the samples represented, our next step was to understand how accurate a natural language processing model would be at correctly classifying random samples from pre-illness and acute illness stages. And then we wanted to look at which aspects of language really drove the accuracy of these models. And so looking at this here, we were able to find a model that predicted with 68% accuracy whether a particular writing sample fell in the pre-illness or acute illness period. And some of the driving features of this model were determiners, which are words that attach to a noun to express the reference of the noun. So things like the, a, my, some, as well as adjectives, third person singular verbs, and possessive pronouns. And then our final step was to understand how accurate an NLP model would be at discriminating between pre-illness to recovery in order to determine how lasting these changes in language are. So, the idea of is there recovery in language, or are there long-term deficits that are seen? And the best model we could find here really only predicted with 50% accuracy which time period a random writing sample was in. And so what this tells us is that while there do appear to be predictable and consistent changes in language between pre-illness and hospitalization, there really may not be as consistent changes in language between pre-illness and recovery, suggesting that recovery in language really may occur prior to 2 years. Our next steps here are to try to understand the differences in these language features that we see in this study as compared to other disease populations, such as psychosis, to understand how the changes we see associate with clinical symptoms, and potentially to consider natural language processing in the diagnostic evaluation of individuals with NMDA receptor encephalitis. And so I think much of the work that has been done at this point by our group and other groups really has been sort of cross-sectional, retrospective, to understand what are the domains that we need to be looking at in these individuals. And so our next steps from here really are to think about prospective multi-site studies that would assess the trajectory of symptom development and improvement. There are groups working on establishing clinical guidelines and potentially even rating scales for the monitoring of symptoms long-term. And ideally, we would love to create an outcome measure that may be utilized in future clinical trials. I think one of the goals of many of these clinical trials is to identify sort of modifiable features that are associated with differential outcomes. Because if we can predict what some of these features are and can modify them, we can improve patient outcomes across the board. And so with that, I'll stop. I have a long list here of people to thank who've contributed to this work that we've done. I've also included 2 pictures of prior patients of mine whose cases and whose families really drove the questions that underlined a lot of the work that we've done. And then, of course, thank you to the Autoimmune Encephalitis Alliance for their support and encouragement of their readership to participate in many of these studies.